Sexuality, Social Cohesion, and the Management of Human Risk, an Anthropological Report on Cedar Grove. Professor Emeritus Jonathan Hale, Ph.D., Department of Anthropology, University of Cambridge. Visiting Scholar, Inter-Universal Exchange Program. Colleagues, when I was first invited to observe the society known as Cedar Grove, I confess I approached the assignment with professional skepticism. The description I was given, a post-scarcity human society in which sexuality is openly encouraged rather than regulated through repression, triggered a familiar reflex in those of us trained in comparative anthropology. We have seen such claims before, often attached to failed communes, ideological excesses, or romanticized accounts of so-called primitive cultures. What I did not expect was to encounter a society that had not abolished human conflict, violence, jealousy, or death, but had instead integrated these realities into a mature, stable cultural system. What follows is not advocacy, it is analysis. 1. Defining perfected without perfect. Cedar Grove's citizens are physically optimized through long-term nanite symbiosis. Disease is functionally eliminated, aging slowed, and injury rapidly repaired. Yet this has not produced docility or moral purity. Brawls occur, duels occur, murder happens. What is striking is not the absence of danger, but the absence of systemic fear. This distinction is crucial. Cedar Grove has not engineered away human passions. It has removed the structural incentives that turn those passions into chronic social pathologies. 2. Sexuality in Cedar Grove. Description, not idealization. Sexuality in Cedar Grove is normative rather than transgressive, socially integrated rather than privatized, encouraged but never coerced, decoupled from survival, status, and economic bargaining. There is no moral panic surrounding sex, nor is there any cult of sexual excess. Sexual relationships vary. Long-term pair bonds, serial partnerships, triads, and periods of solitude all coexist without stigma. What does not exist is the notion that sex is dangerous because it is shameful, or that it is virtuous because it is transgressive. Sex is treated as one of several core bonding practices, alongside shared labor, ritual, intellectual exchange, and collective caregiving. 3. Why historical sexual revolutions failed where Cedar Grove did not. To understand Cedar Grove's stability, we must contrast it with historical attempts at sexual liberation. 1. The modern Western sexual revolution. The mid-20th century sexual revolution dismantled prohibitive norms, but failed to replace them with emotionally literate structures. Sexual freedom expanded in a context still dominated by economic precarity, gendered power asymmetries, attachment insecurity, commodification of intimacy. Sex became liberated but unanchored, producing anxiety, rivalry, and alienation alongside genuine gains. Cedar Grove avoided this fate by ensuring that sexual openness emerged after social trust, emotional education, and material security were already established. 2. Ideological experiments, early Soviet, Reichian, communal. These movements assumed that sexual liberation would produce social maturity. Cedar Grove inverts this assumption. Here, sexual openness is not a revolutionary instrument, it is a byproduct of achieved maturity. The society did not expect sex to heal trauma, it healed trauma first. 4. Cedar Grove and pre-contact human societies. Anthropologists will recognize familiar patterns in Cedar Grove that echo many pre-contact societies. Across Polynesia, Melanesia, parts of Africa, the Amazon, and pre-Christian Europe, we observe cultures where premarital sexuality was normal, sexual education was communal, Nudity carried little shame. Desire was integrated into cosmology and ritual. These societies were not peaceful utopias. Violence existed. Jealousy existed. Death was common. Yet sexual behavior rarely served as a primary instrument of domination. Why? Because sexuality was embedded in community accountability, not isolated within the private psyche and then weaponized through repression. Cedar Grove resembles these societies, but with one decisive difference: explicit psychological self-knowledge. 5. Loneliness, repression, and social pathology, the avoided spiral. In our own world, we now recognize a grim constellation of correlated phenomena: chronic loneliness, addiction, violence and mass alienation, lifestyle-driven lethal illness, resurgent authoritarianism. Cedar Grove interrupts this spiral at its root. Loneliness is rare, not because everyone is constantly paired, but because social belonging is unconditional. Sexual relationships do not determine social worth. Sexual repression, as understood in psychoanalytic and sociological literature, is functionally absent. There is no surplus of frustrated desire seeking expression through aggression, domination, or ideological rigidity. This does not make Cedar Grove gentle. It makes it honest. 6. Violence without pathology. Perhaps the most counterintuitive finding is this: Cedar Grove's tolerance for risk appears to reduce pathological violence rather than increase it. Because death is no longer statistically inevitable through disease or deprivation, lethal conflict, when it occurs, is experienced as tragic rather than routine, but not as cosmically unjust. There is no mythology of redemptive violence, no eroticization of dominance, no repression demanding release. Conflict is personal, immediate, and finite. 7. Final assessment. Cedar Grove is not perfected because it eliminated human darkness. It is perfected because it stopped lying about it. Sexuality, in this society, functions as anthropology long suspected it once did for much of our species' history: as emotional glue, as social lubricant, as a bonding practice embedded in meaning rather than shame. What Cedar Grove demonstrates, uncomfortably for our own civilization, is that many of our most intractable social crises may not stem from human nature, but from the ways we have systematically distorted it. That is not a comforting conclusion, but it is, I believe, an accurate one.